One of the most important shifts in developing a growth-oriented mindset is learning to attach a sense of reward to effort itself, rather than waiting for the final outcome to feel motivated or satisfied. From a brain perspective, this is largely governed by the dopamine system, which plays a central role in motivation, drive, and reinforcement learning. Most people are conditioned to experience dopamine release only when they achieve a goal, getting good results, winning, or receiving recognition. But this creates a problem, because it makes motivation dependent on outcomes that are often delayed, uncertain, or outside of direct control. When effort is not internally rewarding, the brain begins to interpret it as a cost. This leads to procrastination, avoidance, and a tendency to give up when progress is slow. In contrast, when you deliberately train your brain to recognize effort as meaningful and valuable, you shift the entire motivational system. Effort itself starts to trigger a mild but consistent dopamine release, which reinforces the behavior and increases the likelihood that you will repeat it. This process involves a form of cognitive reframing combined with repetition. Each time you engage in a challenging activity and consciously acknowledge the effort, whether through internal dialogue or brief reflection, you are strengthening the neural association between effort and reward. Over time, this builds a more stable and self-sustaining form of motivation that does not rely solely on external validation or immediate success. The timing of dopamine release is also critical. The brain is highly sensitive to when rewards occur in relation to actions. If dopamine is consistently tied only to the end result, the journey toward that result feels draining and effortful. But if dopamine is linked to the process, showing up, making progress, persisting through difficulty, the brain begins to anticipate reward during the activity itself. This reduces resistance and increases engagement. Another important aspect is the concept of progress tracking. The brain responds strongly to signals of forward movement, even if that movement is small. By breaking larger goals into smaller, manageable steps and recognizing completion of those steps, you create multiple opportunities for dopamine release. This keeps the system active and prevents the drop in motivation that often occurs when goals feel too distant or overwhelming. It's also important to understand that this shift does not eliminate discomfort. Effortful activities will still require energy and focus, and they may still feel challenging. What changes is how the brain interprets that effort. Instead of seeing it as something to avoid, it becomes something that carries its own intrinsic reward. This subtle shift can significantly increase persistence over time. Environmental and behavioral cues can support this process. For example, setting up consistent routines or rituals around effortful tasks can help condition the brain to expect engagement and reward in those contexts. Even small actions like starting at the same time each day or using a specific workspace can reinforce the association between effort and positive internal states. Over time, as this pattern is repeated, the brain becomes more efficient at initiating and sustaining effort without requiring strong external incentives. This is what allows individuals with a growth-oriented mindset to remain consistent and motivated even in the absence of immediate results. A core component of developing a growth-oriented mindset is changing how your brain interprets failure. By default, the brain is wired to avoid situations that produce negative outcomes, because from an evolutionary standpoint, failure could signal risk or threat. But in modern learning environments, failure is not only inevitable, it's necessary for improvement. The key shift is to reframe failure as useful feedback rather than as a signal to stop. When you make a mistake, specific brain regions become active, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in error detection and conflict monitoring. This system flags the mismatch between what you expected to happen and what actually occurred. In individuals who avoid challenges or interpret failure negatively, this signal is often followed by disengagement. The brain essentially categorizes the experience as something to avoid in the future. However, if you stay engaged after an error and direct your attention toward understanding what went wrong, you recruit additional neural circuits involved in learning and adaptation, especially in the prefrontal cortex. This allows the brain to update its internal models, adjust strategies, and improve future performance. In this way, failure becomes a source of high-quality information rather than a dead end. The emotional response to failure plays a major role in determining which path the brain takes. If failure triggers excessive frustration, shame, or self-criticism, it can activate stress-related circuits that impair cognitive flexibility. High levels of stress reduce the brain's ability to think clearly, solve problems, and learn from the experience. This is why managing your emotional response is not just about feeling better, it directly impacts your capacity to improve. One effective approach is to create a slight pause between the experience of failure and your interpretation of it. This pause allows you to shift from an automatic emotional reaction to a more deliberate analytical one. Instead of asking, "Why did I fail?" in a self-critical way, the focus shifts to what specifically can be adjusted. This keeps the brain oriented toward problem solving rather than self-judgment. Another important factor is repetition. The more frequently you expose yourself to manageable levels of challenge and failure, the more familiar and less threatening these experiences become. This reduces the intensity of the negative emotional response over time and strengthens the brain's ability to stay engaged during difficulty. Essentially, you are training your nervous system to tolerate and even expect errors as part of the process. There is also a predictive component involved. If your brain learns to associate failure with learning and eventual improvement, it begins to interpret errors differently from the outset. Instead of triggering avoidance, failure becomes part of a larger expected trajectory. This shift reduces fear and increases willingness to take on difficult tasks. Social context can reinforce this process. Environments that normalize mistakes and emphasize learning over perfection tend to produce more adaptive responses to failure. When feedback is framed around strategy, effort, and adjustment, it supports the brain's natural learning mechanisms rather than shutting them down. Over time, consistently reframing failure as feedback changes the way your brain processes challenges. Errors become informative signals that guide behavior rather than obstacles that block progress. The way you speak to yourself during moments of challenge has a direct and measurable impact on how your brain responds, adapts, and continues to engage. Internal language is not just passive narration. It actively shapes neural activity, influencing motivation, emotional regulation, and problem-solving capacity. In the context of a growth-oriented mindset, using precise and flexible internal language becomes a powerful tool for keeping the brain in a state that supports learning. When you encounter something difficult, the brain quickly generates interpretations, often in the form of automatic thoughts. If those thoughts are absolute and limiting, phrases like, "I can't do this," or "I'm not good at this," they signal to the brain that the situation is fixed and unchangeable. This type of language reduces activation in areas associated with effort and cognitive control, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, and can increase avoidance behavior. The brain essentially downshifts, conserving energy because it no longer expects improvement to be possible. In contrast, when you introduce more flexible and process-oriented language, such as "I can't do this yet," or "I need a different strategy," you keep the brain engaged in a problem-solving mode. That single word, "yet," is not just motivational. It preserves a sense of future possibility, which is critical for maintaining activation in neural circuits responsible for planning, attention, and persistence. It tells the brain that the situation is dynamic and can be influenced by effort and learning. This type of language also interacts with emotional regulation systems. Harsh self-talk tends to amplify stress responses, increasing activity in brain regions like the amygdala that are involved in threat detection. When the brain interprets a situation as threatening, it prioritizes short-term survival responses over long-term learning, which can impair memory formation and flexible thinking. More neutral or constructive internal dialogue helps keep stress within a manageable range, allowing higher-order cognitive functions to remain active. Another important aspect is specificity. Vague or global statements like, "I always fail," or "I'm bad at everything," are not only inaccurate but also unhelpful from a neural standpoint. They do not provide actionable information, so the brain has no clear pathway for adjustment. In contrast, specific language such as, "I need to improve my timing," or "I didn't prepare enough for this part," directs attention to concrete variables that can be changed. This shifts the brain into a mode focused on targeted improvement rather than generalized self-evaluation. Repetition of internal language patterns strengthens corresponding neural pathways. If negative, fixed statements are repeated frequently, they become more automatic and more deeply embedded, requiring less conscious effort to activate. On the other hand, consistently practicing adaptive language gradually makes those patterns more automatic. Over time, your default response to challenge becomes more constructive without requiring as much deliberate effort. There is also a feedback loop between language and behavior. The way you frame a situation internally influences whether you persist, adjust, or withdraw. That behavior then produces outcomes, which reinforce the original narrative. By intervening at the level of language, you can shift this loop in a more adaptive direction, increasing the likelihood of continued effort and eventual improvement. Even subtle changes in phrasing can alter how the brain categorizes an experience, whether it sees it as a dead end or as part of an ongoing process of growth and adaptation. A growth-oriented mindset depends heavily on your ability to regulate stress in a way that supports rather than disrupts performance and learning. Stress is not inherently negative. In fact, a certain level of stress is necessary to drive focus, alertness, and motivation. The challenge is that the brain operates within an optimal range of stress, and when that range is exceeded, the systems required for clear thinking and adaptation begin to break down. At moderate levels, stress increases the release of neurochemicals like adrenaline and dopamine, which enhance attention and energy. This state can sharpen focus and improve performance, particularly on tasks that require engagement and effort. In this zone, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for planning, decision-making, and cognitive flexibility, remains active and effective. This is the state where learning and growth are most likely to occur. However, when stress becomes too intense or prolonged, the body releases higher levels of cortisol, a hormone associated with the stress response. Elevated cortisol can impair the functioning of the prefrontal cortex and shift control toward more primitive brain regions involved in threat detection and habitual behavior. This reduces your ability to think strategically, adapt to new information, and regulate emotions. In this state, challenges are more likely to feel overwhelming, and the brain becomes biased toward avoidance or impulsive decisions. One of the key skills in cultivating a growth-oriented mindset is learning to keep stress within that optimal window. This involves both recognizing when stress levels are rising and having tools to bring them back down to a manageable level. Physiological techniques can be particularly effective because they work directly on the nervous system. For example, slow, controlled breathing, especially emphasizing longer exhales, can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps calm the body and reduce excessive arousal. Another important factor is how you interpret stress. The brain does not respond only to the physical sensation of stress, but also to the meaning you assign to it. If you interpret stress as a sign that you are incapable or in danger, it amplifies the negative response. But if you interpret it as a signal that you are engaging in something meaningful or challenging, the same physiological state can be experienced as more manageable and even beneficial. This cognitive reframing can shift how the brain processes stress signals and maintain engagement under pressure. Preparation and structure also play a role in stress regulation. When you approach tasks with a clear plan and defined steps, the brain experiences less uncertainty, which reduces unnecessary stress activation. Breaking larger challenges into smaller, more manageable components can prevent stress from escalating beyond the optimal range. Sleep and recovery are critical in maintaining this balance. Chronic sleep deprivation elevates baseline stress levels and reduces the brain's capacity to regulate emotional and cognitive responses. This makes it much harder to stay within the optimal stress zone, especially during demanding tasks. Exposure to manageable levels of stress, followed by recovery, can actually strengthen your system over time. This process, sometimes referred to as stress inoculation, trains the brain and body to handle increasing levels of challenge without becoming overwhelmed. By repeatedly experiencing stress in a controlled way and successfully navigating it, you build confidence and resilience. Your ability to grow is closely tied to your ability to stay engaged during difficulty, and that depends on keeping your internal state within a range where learning systems remain online and functional. A central principle of building a growth-oriented mindset is understanding that the brain changes through repetition and consistency, not through single moments of insight or motivation. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, depends on the repeated activation of specific neural circuits. Each time you engage in a behavior, whether it's practicing a skill, focusing your attention, or persisting through difficulty, you strengthen the connections associated with that behavior. This process follows a simple but powerful rule. Neurons that fire together wire together. When you consistently repeat an action or thought pattern, the connections between the involved neurons become more efficient and more likely to activate in the future. Over time, what initially requires effort and conscious control can become more automatic. This is how habits form, and it's also how a growth-oriented mindset becomes stable rather than something you have to constantly force. In the early stages of learning or behavior change, the brain requires a higher level of energy and attention. The prefrontal cortex is heavily involved, guiding deliberate actions and maintaining focus. This is why starting something new often feels difficult and mentally demanding. But with repetition, control gradually shifts toward more efficient neural pathways, reducing the cognitive load required to perform the same task. Consistency accelerates this transition, while inconsistency disrupts it. One of the key challenges is that the brain is highly sensitive to gaps in repetition. When behaviors are performed irregularly, the associated neural circuits do not receive enough reinforcement to strengthen effectively. This leads to slower progress and makes it easier for older, less adaptive patterns to remain dominant. In contrast, even small but consistent efforts can produce significant changes over time because they provide steady input for neural adaptation. The timing of repetition also matters. Spacing out practice over time tends to be more effective than concentrating it into a single intense session. This allows the brain to consolidate learning between sessions, particularly during sleep. Each time you return to the activity, you reactivate and strengthen the same circuits, gradually building a more robust and durable network. Consistency also interacts with motivation. When you perform an action regularly, it becomes part of your routine, reducing the need for constant decision-making. This lowers the reliance on willpower, which is limited and can fluctuate based on factors like stress, sleep, and energy levels. By embedding behaviors into a consistent schedule, you make them more resistant to these fluctuations. Feedback is another important component. Repetition alone is not enough if the behavior is not adjusted based on outcomes. When you combine consistent practice with small, ongoing corrections, the brain refines its internal models more effectively. This leads to more efficient learning and better long-term results. Environment can either support or disrupt consistency. Cues in your surroundings, such as specific locations, times of day, or preceding actions, can trigger behaviors automatically if they are reliably paired together. By structuring your environment to include these cues, you make it easier to maintain repetition without relying entirely on conscious effort. Over time, consistent repetition builds momentum. The brain becomes more efficient at initiating and sustaining the behaviors associated with growth, making them feel more natural and less effortful. Your environment plays a powerful role in shaping whether a growth-oriented mindset actually takes hold, because the brain is constantly adapting to the inputs and cues around it. This includes not only the physical spaces you occupy, but also the people you interact with, the type of feedback you receive, and the challenges you are regularly exposed to. These external factors continuously influence your internal patterns of thinking, motivation, and behavior. One of the most important aspects of environment is social input. The brain is highly sensitive to how others respond to effort, failure, and success. If you are surrounded by people who emphasize innate ability, statements like, "You're just naturally talented," or "You're not cut out for this," the brain begins to encode performance as something fixed. In contrast, environments that highlight effort, strategy, and improvement reinforce the idea that abilities can be developed. Over time, these messages become internalized, shaping how you evaluate your own progress and challenges. Feedback is a key mechanism through which this happens. When feedback focuses on what can be adjusted, such as technique, preparation, or consistency, it directs the brain toward actionable changes. This engages circuits involved in learning and adaptation. On the other hand, vague or purely evaluative feedback, especially when it's negative, can trigger defensive responses and reduce willingness to engage. The brain becomes more focused on protecting itself than on improving performance. Physical environment also matters more than most people realize. The spaces you associate with certain activities can become powerful cues that either support or hinder growth. For example, if a specific location is consistently used for focused work or learning, the brain begins to associate that environment with concentration and effort. Entering that space can automatically shift your mental state in that direction. This reduces the friction involved in starting difficult tasks and makes consistent engagement more likely. Exposure to challenge is another critical element. A growth-oriented mindset is strengthened when you regularly encounter tasks that are slightly beyond your current ability but still achievable with effort. This creates what's often referred to as a stretch zone, where the brain is pushed to adapt without becoming overwhelmed. If your environment lacks challenge, growth slows because the brain has no reason to update its existing patterns. If the challenges are too extreme, stress can become excessive and disrupt learning. There's also an element of selection involved. The content you consume, whether it's conversations, media, or educational material, feeds into your cognitive framework. Repeated exposure to ideas that emphasize learning, adaptability, and effort reinforces those patterns in the brain. Over time, this shapes your expectations about what is possible and how progress occurs. Another factor is accountability and structure. Environments that include some form of external accountability, such as deadlines, collaboration, or regular check-ins, can increase consistency and follow-through. This is not about pressure in a negative sense, but about creating conditions where effort is more likely to be sustained over time. Your brain is continuously updating itself based on patterns it detects in your surroundings. By intentionally shaping those surroundings, choosing supportive people, creating structured spaces, and exposing yourself to meaningful challenges, you make it far more likely that the neural circuits associated with growth, learning, and resilience will be reinforced and maintained. Your environment plays a powerful role in shaping whether a growth-oriented mindset actually takes hold, because the brain is constantly adapting to the inputs and cues around it. This includes not only the physical spaces you occupy, but also the people you interact with, the type of feedback you receive, and the challenges you are regularly exposed to. These external factors continuously influence your internal patterns of thinking, motivation, and behavior. One of the most important aspects of environment is social input. The brain is highly sensitive to how others respond to effort, failure, and success. If you are surrounded by people who emphasize innate ability, statements like, "You're just naturally talented," or "You're not cut out for this," the brain begins to encode performance as something fixed. In contrast, environments that highlight effort, strategy, and improvement reinforce the idea that abilities can be developed. Over time, these messages become internalized, shaping how you evaluate your own progress and challenges. Feedback is a key mechanism through which this happens. When feedback focuses on what can be adjusted, such as technique, preparation, or consistency, it directs the brain toward actionable changes. This engages circuits involved in learning and adaptation. On the other hand, vague or purely evaluative feedback, especially when it's negative, can trigger defensive responses and reduce willingness to engage. The brain becomes more focused on protecting itself than on improving performance. Physical environment also matters more than most people realize. The spaces you associate with certain activities can become powerful cues that either support or hinder growth. For example, if a specific location is consistently used for focused work or learning, the brain begins to associate that environment with concentration and effort. Entering that space can automatically shift your mental state in that direction. This reduces the friction involved in starting difficult tasks and makes consistent engagement more likely. Exposure to challenge is another critical element. A growth-oriented mindset is strengthened when you regularly encounter tasks that are slightly beyond your current ability, but still achievable with effort. This creates what's often referred to as a stretch zone, where the brain is pushed to adapt without becoming overwhelmed. If your environment lacks challenge, growth slows because the brain has no reason to update its existing patterns. If the challenges are too extreme, stress can become excessive and disrupt learning. There is also an element of selection involved. The content you consume, whether it's conversations, media, or educational material, feeds into your cognitive framework. Repeated exposure to ideas that emphasize learning, adaptability, and effort reinforces those patterns in the brain. Over time, this shapes your expectations about what is possible and how progress occurs. Another factor is accountability and structure. Environments that include some form of external accountability, such as deadlines, collaboration, or regular check-ins, can increase consistency and follow-through. This is not about pressure in a negative sense, but about creating conditions where effort is more likely to be sustained over time. In practical terms, shaping your environment is one of the most efficient ways to support a growth mindset, because it reduces reliance on willpower alone. When your surroundings consistently nudge you toward effort, learning, and improvement, those behaviors become more automatic, allowing the brain to reinforce growth-oriented patterns with less resistance over time.